Hello, and welcome to Spotlight On, the podcast that brings together business leaders, entrepreneurs, and experts covering a range of topics. I'm Nicholas Barton, founder and CEO of the Barton Partnership. We're an award-winning executive recruitment and consulting solutions firm providing permanent search and independent consulting services across strategy, sustainability and M&A, data and analytics, and transformation and change.
We're very happy to be joined today by Amy Silverstein, who is a partner at e2p Capital, a former Deloitte partner. Welcome, Amy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here. It's funny, when you first invited me to be a guest on the podcast, I was not only honored by the theme, but also some of your recent guests like Angela Cretu and Jessica Frame, which I guess is a little bit more dated now, a year ago. But I would laugh to myself because I thought women in leadership sounds to me like somebody who has reached this career pinnacle and then they're reflecting back, on their career and imparting wisdom to others. And I feel I'm so grateful for all the experiences that have brought me to this moment. And in so many ways, I feel like I'm just getting started. So anyway, that's my mindset coming into this conversation.
Well, we are so happy to have you. And yeah, you're in great company. I obviously gave a little introduction for you. I'd love it if you could start with a bit of an introduction in your own words about you and your career journey so far.
Absolutely. So as I have been introducing myself quite a bit recently with being in this relatively new role, I joined Entrepreneurial Equity Partners in July of this year, E2p Capital, as you said. And I realize on the surface, my career journey seems a little bit paradoxical, to go from 90s management consultant to CSR leader to private equity partner. But if you look just below the surface, there's actually a very cohesive thread across. Yeah. And I think the two things I would point to is one, I have spent the majority of my career really pursuing the leading edge of the market for purpose, sustainability, and ESG. And maybe it's implicit in that I have created almost every role that I've held. And honestly, in many ways, this is not, the path wasn't accidental, kind of saw a future and manifested it to a great extent. And just to say it in a more kind of funny and humble way, I was sitting with a friend of mine who's a partner in a private equity firm. We won't name names, based in New York. And about 5 years ago, and I said, the next operating role in private equity will be a chief ESG officer or a chief purpose officer. And I'm going to hold that role. And that is going to be kind of my career ambition. And he said, this just proves that consultants think they know everything about everything. Nobody in private equity cares about this. And that's never going to happen. And in any event, when the opportunity with E2p came up this spring, he quickly, revisionist history, said, don't you remember 5 years ago when I was, we were sitting in New York and I told you ESG was going to be the next big thing in private equity. So anyway, I'm the newest partner at E2p. Today, I'm focused on building ESG as an asset in our portfolio and also leading and really formalizing our ecosystem of entrepreneurs and family-owned businesses, which I'll talk a little bit more about. For background, E2p is a middle market private equity firm based in Chicago. With our food focus and our growth ethos, there's a very natural alignment to ESG. And those were, I think, two of the multiple factors that really attracted me to this role. But as I said, today I'm focused on building ESG as an asset, both in the current portfolio and also as part of our full investment lifecycle. And it is really, like, all kidding aside, it's a very natural extension of my work over the last 20 years. Prior to this role, I was a managing director with Deloitte Consulting, as you said, where I spent the past 20 years. And I was within our corporate strategy practice, I was a founding member and I led much of our ESG strategy work. And what does that mean? It was working with Fortune 100 executives, advising executives on how to incorporate environmental, social, and governance factors into growth strategy. And it was really, through that work, I had the opportunity to see firsthand how when you integrate ESG directly at the center of the business, the opportunity you have to accelerate impact in a very targeted way, and also grow revenue, build equity in your brand, build more engaged relationships with stakeholders. I'm very committed to bringing those learnings into my work now in the private markets.
Thank you. That's a great introduction. And I love the piece, especially around creating your own roles. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. But like you said, you were nearly 20 years at Deloitte and had a very interesting progression. How did you decide it was the right time to leave consulting? And a lot of people listening to this will currently be thinking about that transition themselves. So how did you know it was the right time for you? And what advice would you give for people going through that thought process themselves?
So I am going to answer that question, but I forgot a very important part of my self-introduction, which is that I'm the mother of 3 children, 2 teenage girls, Jessica and Sloan, and a son who is 11 years old. And the reason that comes to mind as you're asking me this next question is that they are, of course, I'm a proud mother, but they are also my 3 probably toughest critics and biggest supporters. And we're not insignificant in making this decision, believe it or not. When you ask me that about leaving Deloitte, I think an important point here is that it was really for me much less about leaving consulting and much more about running towards a dream role. And just to kind of step back on a personal note, I had long aspired to, even as the story about my friend in New York and talking about this intersection of ESG and private equity that I was really starting to see 5 years ago. I had long aspired to a leadership position in private equity as I really saw the ownership model as a even more tangible opportunity to make an impact and, really demonstrate the quantifiable value and impact from ESG. But that being said, I thought it was 10 years in the making, and it would likely be an end of career role. And I don't mean, yes, of course, today we're seeing multiple roles in ESG pop up across private equity, across the investment space more broadly. But I'm talking about truly integrated strategic ESG.
Yeah.
And so 2 reflections. So 1, my most fulfilling experiences in consulting were when I had the opportunity to work with, and I think about the largest prestige cosmetics portfolio house in the United States. I was with them for 5 years, from ESG strategy, co-creating the ESG strategy, to then really bringing it to fruition across a multi-billion-dollar global enterprise. And you realize I had personal connection and accountability in that kind of work that was beyond what I had experienced maybe in a typical strategy project. And I felt like I was excited about the chance to extend that even further. In the PE model, we are partnering with businesses, directly invested in them as an owner and also board member. So it is an opportunity to take that, even a step further. But again, I thought this was still 5 to 10 years away, just given the market. And then my partner likes to say, like, man plans and God laughs. I was connected to Mark and CJ, who are the co-founders of E2p, Mark Burgett and CJ Frawley. And their vision is really what caused me to move that plan up 10 years. For just 2 more minutes on what's the secret sauce that made this such a natural partnership. First, Mark and CJ are industry veterans. They bring the integration of investment and operations, right at the helm of the firm. And they saw an opportunity for this to be a partner level role, working with access across all of our portfolio companies, with the management teams across our portfolio companies, working hand in hand with the other investment professionals to evaluate opportunities, and working hand in hand with our investors. And I think that's just a different level of access and creates a different kind of opportunity in terms of how you can integrate ESG, how you can really bring it to every aspect.
I think it's really interesting talking about sort of that tangible and quantifiable impact of ESG. We'll come back to it again throughout the conversation, I'm sure. Your career, it has been very interesting, like you mentioned and you alluded to start with, around how you created nearly every role that you've had. You were focused on CSR before CSR almost even existed. And again, looking at CSR before, it was focusing on some of the big social movements we've seen over the past 5 years or so. And now ESG Can you talk a little bit more about that evolution and anything else that you'd like to add around how you've created a space for you from a professional and, again, quantifiably value add role when it hasn't always existed? Love to understand how you've done that successfully.
And I think the first thing I would point to when we talk about the white space, when I gave my presentation for partner at Deloitte, I opened with a line that said, I'm not an activist. 10 years ago, somebody was in here, I was presenting to a panel of partners. 10 years ago, somebody was in here telling you the future is cloud or the future is digital. I said, I'm a capitalist and I'm telling you the future is purpose and ESG. And it kind of went from there. And I ultimately was the first partner promoted in ESG strategy at the firm. And I still don't say that in a bragging way. I say it in a, wow, there's a lot of excitement and opportunity, and there's a lot of struggle in creating white space, right? And in working in an area that people don't really understand. But I saw that future early on, and specifically the chance to change the mindset of ESG or corporate social responsibility as a concession to business and really zone in on the space where ESG, CSR, purpose, sustainability, where it can be accretive. And that requires a discipline both on the business side and on the social responsibility side, right? To find that intersection. I like to say, not all ESG is good ESG for your particular organization. And I felt like there was a chance to create a different threshold, set a different threshold for how those on both sides of the aisle approached it. I will say, in looking back, I do credit some of this to my earliest experience at Arthur Andersen, which was such a civic responsibility ethos. From the day you walked in, I remember filling out my paperwork in the new hire orientation as a new consultant there. And this is a kind of a funny example, but they say, okay, well, we give to the United Way. So here's your donation card, and just let us know how much of your paycheck you'd like to donate. And that's a very old school kind of legacy, right? It's like old school philanthropy. However, that was the mindset from day one. You can't be a leader if you are not cognizant of the community you operate in, of the broader sort of context you operate in. So anyway, that's kind of like going back to how did you see the future? In terms of the evolution, I am asked about this all the time. In every way, I was probably more lucky than smart, which I would take any day of the week. But I spent many years striving to move the needle on this path. And then it seemingly overnight hit the mainstream. And I think about like Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point. ESG is such, and you and I talked about this before, it's such a prime example of going slow to go fast. And while I could walk you through the evolution from CSR to Porter's shared value, instead, I would point to two moments that I think were really the tipping points, at least in my mind. One is January 2018 with Larry Fink's first op-ed in the New York Times about where he's essentially staking his personal reputation and BlackRock's, I think at the time, $8 trillion of assets under management on this platform of purpose and stakeholder capitalism as the best path, the most reliable path to shareholder value. That's one. And the second, honestly, is March 2020, when the intersecting social, economic, and health crises that I think really brought into sharp focus the stakeholder dynamics that were just below the surface mounting for many years. Some of my wonkier ESG friends like to say, we went into 2020 with E in the driver's seat. And then by the end of 2020, S had fully taken over the wheel.
Yeah, it's really interesting to have been part of it during such huge movements like we've spoken about in the past. I also think, I know you said, you're not saying it in a bragging way. I think sort of the discipline, the foresight, and to some extent the bravery that you have had to have this as the driving force in your career. I think you can say it in a bragging way, very justifiably, if you want.
But you know what, when you say that, I've neglected to mention one piece. When you talk about carving out a space for yourself that didn't exist, I have in more recent months realized, in many ways, that is for better or for it does take a level of bravery. And in some ways, maybe it would have been easier to be one of those people. One of my mentors used to say, one of the people who operate under the fat part of the curve. However, I think that this is my personal superpower, and it's one that I have tried to coach other men and women that I've mentored to take hold of. And to me, I think it's really come down to three things. Like one, I'm not afraid to question the status quo. And it doesn't mean be a vigilante, right? It means have a strong fact base, have some ability, what they teach you in strategy consulting school, all about pattern recognition. So strong fact base, pattern recognition, and some degree of vision. And you're right, bravery to kind of stand up in front and promote that vision to others. Relationships, nobody does it alone. I've never been more clear about that until the last couple of years. And so I think Uber relationship building is key, but also the age-old resilience and never give up. I was sitting in my son's classroom today for a parent-teacher conference, and there was a poster on the wall that said, do something. And there were multiple kind of sentences below it. And it was like, do something. If that doesn't work, try to break the problem down into smaller pieces. If that doesn't work, every time you come up to an obstacle, step back, iterate, and do something else, until you get to the end. And I took a picture of it because I thought, yeah, that's right.
I love that. Slow and steady. It's just always just keep trying, keep going, keep moving forward. You've talked in interviews recently with Greenbiz, for example, around how ESG is becoming fundamental in the investment process, obviously reflected in your trust in making this move into private equity. And you just mentioned around that tangible, that quantifiable impact of this area. Can you talk a little about how this influences the investments that E2p is making and how it influences even perhaps how you're working with your portcos?
Yeah, absolutely. ESG is not new to E2p. The introduction of my role is really building on what has been a longstanding ethos and really creating a more formal approach to ESG as part of our investment process. So we're in the earliest stages of building this. As I mentioned, I joined the firm in July of this year, but I can tell you how we're approaching it. And it comes down to three things. One, I have distinguished, and I really learned this through my work at Deloitte, learn to distinguish ESG capability from level of ambition. And we're working with each of our portfolio companies to build a really sound and a new ESG muscle, if you will, that is rooted in strategy, governance, and reporting. And so the way I like to think about it is if you have a strong ESG capability, you have transparency and visibility to your performance on the things that matter, you can calibrate your level of ambition to what is appropriate, right, for your company, your stakeholders. And so second, on that topic of what matters, we have a laser focus on materiality. And I would repeat that 10 times before we hang up today, because I think I heard Aaron Yoon, who's a Kellogg professor, do a webcast last week on ESG. He's published multiple papers. I would encourage anyone listening to, he's, I think, profound in his simplicity, but he said very simply, materiality equals what matters to your business. And this gets back to my point on not all ESG is good ESG. If you're an airline, an air carrier versus a food company, there's going to be a different set of issues that matter for your business. And there is a whole set of field research out there demonstrating, including Aaron's, that companies who focus on material issues and specifically do not focus on the immaterial issues achieve outsized financial returns. So that's number two. And then the third point is building the integrated strategic ESG program, both at the portfolio company and at the firm. At the firm level, this means how ESG just becomes another part of our investment process, from pre-acquisition due diligence through post-acquisition management, all the way through to the exit process.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear it because I think it's still newer within our private equity clients and private equity in general. So I think it's exciting to talk to someone like yourself who's obviously at the forefront of implementing that within a newer industry. In the same interview where you were talking around sort of the investment process, you talk a lot around the expectations that ESG skills and capabilities will become core to every role in the firm, from analyst through to managing partner. What are those skills? What do you think is going to become critical over the next 5 years that people can, if they want to drive their career in this area, they can be focusing on, or that they can even transfer across?
Okay, so I am going to kind of reframe the question. I'd say that from my perspective, it's less about new skills and more about adding ESG as a lens to all the skills, like to all the other skills that exist. So what does that mean for our firm? As I said, we're integrating ESG into our investment process as just another lens. It's like broadening the aperture, right, on our investment process to more formally add some of these other considerations. And I say that specifically because things like food safety, employee health and safety, those were always there. I think it's been interesting, actually, as I've visited our portfolio companies, while ESG may be a new term, as soon as you go one click down, like the light goes off. Oh, wait a minute. I keep joking. ESG, we're already doing it. There's a set of things, of course, you're already doing, because it's a natural extension of good business principles and good business practices. So in any event, we're incorporating this as another lens. And so for our firm, and I think for investment firms in general, every role in the firm is going to need to become ESG conversant in order to do their job better and have a fundamental understanding of materiality. Of course, skills like strategy, business transformation, reporting, and compliance will only continue to be more critical in this new world order, I believe. But just to kind of put a finer point on that, when I have young people approaching me all the time asking about a future career in ESG, and I commonly will encourage them or advise them to think about ESG as more of a minor and not a major, that you will have, as you think about a future in finance or marketing or technology, ESG will become a differentiator for this next generation of leaders. And the ESG minors are our future CEOs, CFOs, chief investment officers.
It makes perfect sense. And I think it's probably most comparable to how we were thinking about digital sort of 15 to 20 years ago. Thank you. That's great. Shifting slightly to an area we're obviously very passionate about together is women in ESG and women in leadership within ESG. When we spoke previously, you mentioned that you were a panelist at the Gender Equity in Private Equity conference quite recently. You're obviously now a partner in private equity. Can you share some of your thoughts around gender equity in the industry? Perhaps any highlights from that conference, which I know was a great conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I spoke to you right afterwards, and I think I came back from that conference so energized. I was truly incredibly impressed as a new woman in finance and private equity. I think by a couple of things. But overarching, I left with this impression of a cohort of women who are really approaching this in such a fundamental and authentic way, different than a programmatic approach to gender equity, right? And so a couple examples of that is we have Sahar Global Summits who put on the conference. Their premise is rather than spend 2 days focused on gender equity as a content in and of itself, we are going to focus on creating a platform for women who are experts in their particular area of private equity to really showcase their voice. And I thought that was incredible. And then second, the numerous examples I can give you of women who are in leadership positions in their firms, really committed to funding other women and funding men who lead firms that support women. Also, very inspired by the organizations who are doing great work and really moving the needle in this space, like a PE Win, Girls Who Invest, 100 Women in Finance. I have 2 daughters who are interested in a future career in the investment space. And so thinking about the different pathways that will be open to them as a result is just awesome. But my overall takeaway that I brought back to my firm is really the whole dialogue was around this idea that when we invest in creating employers of choice, becoming employers of choice and developing future leaders, as opposed to a more transactional approach to recruiting and retention, we create spaces and pathways for professionals of all races and genders to thrive. And that is absolutely was my experience at Deloitte and now at E2p. I don't know if I told you this before, but I was the first female partner hired at Deloitte. I was the first female at E2p. I was the first female hired at E2p. And I sensed a real commitment to people, a very authentic commitment to people. And again, that was far more important to me than a programmatic approach to hiring more women. I will say in our, what was then a 9-person firm, we have since hired 5 additional women. So I'm very excited about that.
I think it's that authenticity piece that you mentioned a couple of times. I think it really ties into the importance, not just of DE&I within private equity, but also ESG as a whole. We're seeing as we approach candidates for particular roles, they are not just saying, okay, that's an interesting opportunity. They're really trying to understand, is this firm actually committed to ESG, to sustainability, to climate? What are they doing themselves as well as for their clients or their portcos? How much of this is just greenwashing? So I think that authenticity piece it has, especially when you're combining those two things, diversity and sustainability, it probably has never been more important.
I couldn't agree with you more. And it's funny you say that because in my own panel at the recent conference, I was talking about how, having been on this path since before most people could spell ESG, seeing the uptick recently has been, of course, gratifying, but it's also been highly frustrating. You use the word greenwashing, but just seeing the dilution of the term where it's in some cases starting to mean everything and nothing. And this is a space where I think private equity has a really unique opportunity to rationalize and clarify good ESG work in a way that is very beneficial to society and, frankly, to the respective businesses that we're running.
I love that. Thank you. You've talked a little bit already about how you think firms can attract women or diverse talent across the board. And you've talked about advising people looking at careers in ESG. What about women, people like your daughters, looking for that career in investment, looking for that career in private equity? What's your advice to them?
Oh my gosh. Well, looking for a career in private equity, I would say creating or articulating that North Star, maybe no different than my point a little while ago about carving out white space for yourself, right? Really articulating the vision and the future that you want to see, but then working from there to here. I had a mentor who used to talk about when we try to take clients from here to there in strategy, that it's too overwhelming to think about the iterative steps, right, to get to a future. But if you work from the future backwards, you can evaluate kind of the next opportunity in that light. And it starts to become, the path starts to become exponential as opposed to linear, but always focused on what is going to bring you the most fulfillment and reward today, as opposed to, I think when I was first coming up, right, this idea of this linear career path, and you kind of just swallow the current state. You just kind of tolerate the current state in order to get to that path. I think what I'm proposing is the opposite of that. Bet on yourself. Think about the North Star. Keep it in mind, but make sure you're really true to yourself in the roles that you're taking on in the near term.
Just coming back to that authentic piece again, it's so important. We've talked about private equity, consulting, career progression. We've talked around ESG and women in the industry. What are you most excited about across those topics as a woman in private equity or as an ESG leader? What are you looking forward to the most?
Right. Well, I will say, as an ESG leader, probably the point I made before about I do think there's an opportunity in the private markets to create clarity and rationalization on this topic in a way that can unlock an incredible potential. As a woman in private equity, just building on that, I have been struck to realize I just have a new appreciation for the potential to really make change. So before this, I was working primarily for public company clients, right? Fortune 100. In this shift to private equity, realizing the potential that the private markets have to scale impact has been striking and really energizing to me. Honestly, I learned as I was doing research for something I'm working on, I learned the private equity and private equity backed companies today employ more than 11.7 million people across the US. And then it's another 7.1 million when you factor in suppliers. And these are real people in communities across the US, right? It's not just New York and California. It's not just the major markets. This is communities of every shape and size. And when I have just completed this roadshow of our own companies, which I'm incredibly proud of. And I look at the great work our companies are doing, food tech innovation that has real social and environmental impact, creating safe, quality jobs for workers of all skill levels across the US. I imagine the potential at scale and the opportunity to impact real people, and whether it's a single life or a number of people at scale. So that's very exciting to me. And then as a mother, I feel inspired for all of our children, because I think the clear path to sustainable progress is there is a role for philanthropy, but sustainable progress, if we just focus on climate change and jobs for a minute, that requires a more sustainable model. And so I start to see more potential for this future in a world they can feel proud and I think more hopeful to inherit.
That's great. Thank you. Amy, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. I love the idea. I think my takeaways of sort of ESG as a minor and just making sure that's infiltrating into all parts of our world, whether it's finance, whether it's marketing, whatever it might be. And I love the idea of sort of showcasing superpowers, whether it's our own and embracing them, or whether it's other people's and supporting others, especially women as they're coming up through their careers as well. Thank you. This has been a lot of fun and I think very interesting and probably inspiring listening for a lot of people out there.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been a great conversation and one that I hope we will continue.